This is the agenda for today's meeting. So Karen Sadlier-Brown is going to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Allie Rougeot. After Allie's presentation, we are going to have a moderated question and answer period. As at all of our monthly meetings, we will have an action of the day, something that each of us can do to make a difference. Then we will talk about some of our upcoming meetings and any announcements. And as with all our monthly learning meetings, we do have an after chat, which we encourage you to join. And it's a very friendly discussion, and a lot of information is exchanged. So now it is time to turn the meeting over to Karen Sadlier-Brown, who has the privilege of introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Aliénor Rougeot. Allie has been an environmental and human rights advocate since the age of 10 and has been passionate about sustainability and climate justice since high school. She moved to Canada from France to study economics and public policy when she was 17. While at the University of Toronto, where she studied, she co-founded Fridays for Future Toronto. Allie came to national prominence as a national strike organizer, and in 2019, she led the Fridays for Future school strike for climate, which brought out over 50,000 people. For her work as a climate activist, I want to give you just a partial list of her numerous awards and recognitions. Corporate Knights in 2019 as one of the under 30 sustainability leaders. Toronto Life in 2019 is one of the 50 most influential Torontonians. The Starfish in 2020 as one of the top 25 environmentalists under 25. By the Canadian Voice for Women for Peace with the Kim Pook Youth Award. She was also invited to speak at the United Nations Environment Day in 2019. And yesterday, Allie was in Ottawa testifying before the Parliament Environment Committee about the impact of tar sands mining, including its toxic tailings waste on groundwater. All of this, and she has just turned 25. I will turn it over to Allie now with great pleasure, who's going to discuss COP28, which she attended, as well as her perspective as a young climate activist. Allie, we're really looking forward to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, Sharon, and thanks all of you for having me. I'm blushing very much from that introduction. That was very generous. And I think we should all agree to have awards for climate activists that aren't only about 20 under 20 or 30 under 30, because I know so many activists who are well over 30 and deserve to be recognized. So maybe that's a project we could work on together. But thank you nevertheless for having me and for this introduction. And I'm really glad to see, some familiar names, people that I've had the pleasure of organizing with, and newer folks. It's great to cross paths. So, as was said, today I'm hoping we can talk a bit more about COP28. It was my first time attending COP. I followed the COP process for a very long time, and then this time had an actual, mandate to go, opportunity to go. And so I'd love to debrief with you on what happened, and then maybe at the end, wrap up with sharing a bit more about how I got to this work, not because I think it's, outstanding, but actually because I think it gives us one example of a way a young person was empowered to get into this work and now is, lifelong committed to it. And it could help us find ways of bringing other young people and less young people into finding their way into this work. So hopefully that's an exciting conversation to you. If I can ask our slide master to go to the next slide, please. So that's just a bit of our program together, and we can go to the next one already. A bit more about myself. Sorry, next slide, please. That's me again. So I'm currently at Environmental Defense, which is we are a nonprofit organization. We're actually a charity. We advocate for a safe climate, a safe environment for all communities. And we do that mostly by advocating for policies. So a lot of our work is government facing, but really our theory is that we have to bring other Canadians along when we ask for these policies. So, even though we'll do policy analysis, we'll do policy reactions, a big share of our work is doing communications with Canadians who care, who are curious, want to learn more, and helping them find a way to also advocate for this policy, even if they're not climate policy experts at the beginning. And so at Environmental Defense, I work mostly on things related to climate and energy issues. My big focus in the last 2 years has been this topic of a just transition, recognizing that we are going to go an energy transition and that has big implications for workers and for communities. How do we make it fair? What policies could make it fair? And then as Karen was alluding to, some of our work is still focused on the tar sands, which are not only a massive source of climate pollution, but also of local pollution and really devastating for local communities, most of which are indigenous. So that's a bit of my work. And now let's talk about COP. Next slide, please. So, as Sharon mentioned, COP28, and we'll do a little refresher of what that is, but was hosted in the United Arab Emirates, which is a petrostate. It's a country that really built its recent wealth, and it became prominent throughout the world because it based its economy on fossil fuels. And so it is quite curious, not only that we hosted a large climate conference there, but actually that it resulted in a pretty historic outcome in which it was the first time that all countries signed off saying, yes, we need to transition off fossil fuels. So how did that come about? Let's dive into it together. We can get to the next slide. A bit of a refresher, COP actually just stands for Conference of Parties. And the parties that it refers to are all the countries that have signed on to what we call the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this initial framework basically was a very simple agreement of countries saying climate change, it's real, it's human caused, and all countries have an implication and have a responsibility to solve it. And so all these countries became parties to it and started meeting. There was a COP 1, 2, 3, all the way until 28, a meeting to refine what that action was going to be. And I really want to stress that although we often call it, the UN Climate Conference, it's not a showy conference as one that you would go to an industry conference to just learn about new practices or see someone's expose on their newest products. It actually is a negotiation between countries. Now, since then, COPs have also, have more of a trade show aspect on the outside, but the core of it is still negotiating teams from respective countries going to meet and trying to reach actual agreements, international treaties and agreements on climate change. So that's really still what it is. And I think despite all the flaws of COP, that's still why our organizations still get involved in it, because there is that actual that's the part that has teeth, is the fact that they're negotiating. I will say that one of the key reasons we still engage with it, despite, again, its flaws, and I know many of you might be skeptical of the COP process since we've gotten to the 28th and we still haven't solved climate change. But one of the things we can confirm has been the impact of COP is that before, for example, the Paris Agreement, the big COP that was perhaps the most notorious, before that, countries didn't even agree on what our goal was when it came to climate change. Some people thought it's fine to go to 2 degrees or 3 degrees of warming. Some people, small island states were saying, no, we can't tolerate 1 degree. And so the COP process, for example, gave everybody the shared goal of 1.5 degrees of warming and certainly no more than 2 degrees of warming. That really then gave everybody the same goal to work towards. And so that would not have happened had we not had actual international negotiations and people doing this. The other thing I'll mention around the importance of COP is that it is one of the only places where all countries have an equal seat at the table, meaning all countries have a seat at the table. Now, obviously, between you and I and anybody that's worked in diplomacy knows that, of course, dynamics come into play. Maybe a country will be cautious about signing onto something if it knows its ally on other causes wouldn't want them to. But the reality is it's not like the G20, the G7, where a lot of countries are excluded. You really have all countries around the same table and they can all take the mic. And that was a key thing that I saw at COP, was how very small countries were taking the mic right after very big countries, and they had the same speaking time, and they had to listen to each other. And that is really different from what we see the rest of the year when it comes to climate. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll maybe elaborate a bit more on what I mean by that. And I think I insist on why COP matters, because it is happening more and more every year that as COP comes about, we're seeing headlines around, is it even worth it? Is this not a waste of time? We've had, our ministers attend and then be asked by opposition parties whether it was not a waste of taxpayer money. And I think we really have to think about what makes COP important so that we can try to keep it focused on that important part, and maybe also be critical of the parts that are not interesting about COP. So I was just mentioning this, forum from global collaboration on a global crisis is the key attractive aspect of COP. It'd be impossible for us to solve climate change in a corner just as one country, not only because emissions don't know borders, but also because you can imagine that if we were trying to convince domestically Canadians to make lifestyle and make big changes, and then we had no other country doing it, we would really get nowhere. So it's even important in terms of getting public buy-in. It's important to be able to say that other countries are also doing their fair share. And so just for that, it's a worthwhile process to try to bring everybody along. It also is one of those places where countries actually talk about things like money, right? Funding mechanisms are a huge part of COP every year, whether it's funding mechanism to pay for, technology transfers, making sure that countries that haven't yet had the same level of industrialization as ours, let's make sure they don't go through coal and then fossil fuels and then renewables, and actually make sure that they have the funds to leapfrog all that and just go towards clean energies already. So that's one example. And COP really is well set up for that because of the various working groups that countries have where they can negotiate those agreements. One of the other aspects that comes from COP a lot is that there's a lot of bilateral and side deals, right? So these countries are all together for 2 weeks. They're not just negotiating one big final text. A lot of the times you'll see them agree on, a side deal. For example, we saw at some point some just transition partnerships come out where South Africa would partner with the UK on a just transition partnership to make sure that, again, the countries that still want to achieve development goals are able to do that in a way that's sustainable. I mentioned the equity piece already, the fact that countries have an equal seat, or at least a same chance at the mic. I find that this year we saw it particularly well because the small island states, so those states that are in the Pacific and who have everything to lose from climate change, and I really mean everything. Their islands are so often at such a low level in terms of altitude that even a small increase in sea level would absolutely destroy their entire nation. We're really talking about populations that are at risk of becoming permanent refugees somewhere else. And it was so striking to me that at every plenary, you would have the US and Saudi Arabia and China there, and they had to listen to these small island state ministers explain what was at stake. And I think that brought a degree of, reality in the room. And I was glad. I was looking at the Canadian negotiation team, and I was remembering of how political things are getting in Canada when it comes to climate change. I was really glad that these politicians were forced to sit through these very emotional, declarations by entire nations. I think that was really an important aspect that otherwise these teams could avoid the rest of the year. Let's just say they wouldn't actually be forced to think about these in such a real sense. And so this bleeds a bit into the next reason I think COP is quite important and valuable, is that it's a real place for accountability. Every year when COP rolls around, people say, what progress has been made since last year? And actually countries are asked to submit. It's called their nationally determined contributions. They have to submit plans saying this is how Canada is going to contribute to the global goal of addressing climate change. And then they're evaluated on it. They do a lot of peer-to-peer evaluation. In diplomacy, there's a lot of, pointing out that this person hasn't done it. And, so there's a lot of that peer-to-peer pressure. There's, of course, the additional media pressure or civil society pressure. And then on top of that, this is a time also where we can do a bit of accounting, saying, hey, 3 years ago in Paris, all the countries promised billions of dollars for, addressing climate impacts that are already unraveling because of our pollution. Where's that money now? And often we realize, well, that money actually hasn't been sent yet, or that money's been promised, but no one knows how to get it. Or so, it's always this moment of accountability for countries. And then the last point briefly on that is it's a moment of global attention. And that for us who see ourselves as advocates is something we should really take advantage of. It's a moment where the media anyways is looking for a climate story because they need to cover it. It's a moment where politicians are looking for something to announce at COP. Every country will do that, where they'll announce a new climate-related policy or spending or project at COP because they want to be able to do that. So as advocates, we really have to think of this as a tool, thinking, what can we get them to announce this COP? Or how do we want to shape the story that the media says about our country during this moment? And so that was my key takeaway attending COP. I realized we could just let it be a process that happens and it's more and more grandiose and there's more and more, trade show aspects to it. Or we could put our, advocate brains on and say, well, this moment is happening anyways. I don't think, us ignoring it would prevent the ministers from all flocking the next UN venue next year. So how do we actually utilize it? How do we mobilize people in the month before and set an expectation? We want you to announce this by COP or before COP, making sure that when they come back, we are ready with a bit of a plan for accountability. You promised this at COP, or we saw you saying this on the international stage. We've never seen it back home. And then making sure that the people, the advocates that we do send to COP play that role too. They're actually there in the negotiation rooms, raising their hands, saying, Canada's not actually doing all this, or things like that. So that's a bit of my, plea for us not to think only of COP as, a bit of a showy far away thing, but thinking of it as a real tool in our work. We can go to the next slide. I'll talk about the elephant in the room very briefly, which is, why Dubai? Like, why would you go to Dubai to host a climate conference? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I was not thrilled at the prospect of going to the UAE to talk about climate change. I thought, it just from a carbon footprint perspective, but also just from the perspective of how am I going to explain that to my family and friends who I keep telling that we need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. And the first thought that occurred is, well, we also live in a petro state, all of us, and we've built our economy of that. And so let's first be careful not to say they're bad because they're, still the majority of their economy is there, when really we have to look at our own history and realize that a lot of North America is really historically the largest emitter, as well as Europe. The other one is that it actually is based on UN rules that location is decided. So that's the UN basically says every year COP has to be in a different region of the world. And so last year was Africa, that's why Egypt was the host. This year was the Middle East. When it happens, when they say it's this region, countries have to put their hand up and say, I want to host this very complex, high-profile conference. And you can imagine that there's not a ton of countries that actually want to go through that process, or who have the airport, hotel, accommodation, catering infrastructure to have such a high, input. And so, it's naturally countries like Egypt in Africa, or like, the UAE that have that existing infrastructure from a tourism industry mostly. And so that's why. And next year it's going to be in Azerbaijan. I can tell you there weren't a lot of other candidates in Eastern Europe who wanted to raise their hand. And so that's often why we end up with locations that many of us might think are odd choices. That's a bit of the explanation. All of that to say, though, the amount of outcry that happened when Dubai was chosen turned out to be extremely useful, because the president of COP felt so, targeted and so, scrutinized at all times because of his ties to the oil industry in the UAE, that he ended up, I think, doing a much better job at pushing fossil fuel states, petro states, than any past hosts. I think in a sense, he felt like he could speak to these people. He could tell Saudi Arabia, no, you're going to stay at the table. And that was actually perhaps why we were able to get a final text that mentioned fossil fuels, and we never had that before. And we'll get into that in a minute. And we can go to the next slide. I did want to point out that even though I've tried to share with you the reasons I still believe in the COP process, I have to tell you that part of my experience there was that of disappointment in some aspects. And there's real disappointment in the size that it's taken, the fact that in so many ways, countries are now, and companies are really trying to use it as, again, this exhibition, it almost looks like an expo where people are just there to promote themselves. And that, I think, is something that we could aspire to correct as, people that care. And also, there's a lot of unwanted guests, and I really mean that. I like this quote from David Tong, who's a colleague in Oil Change International, which is a great organization doing research mostly on fossil fuel. He said, "You would not invite arms dealers to a peace conference." And so when we see that record numbers of fossil fuel lobbyists and fossil fuel executives are attending these conferences and given access to ministers and negotiation teams, we have to call that out. And there's been decades of calling for a UN clause on conflict of interest. We have to be very strong in that. And I think the first thing we could do is tell at least our own countries, don't give them access. We can't control what other countries do, but we should tell our own countries that they shouldn't be given access. And this year, Canada's official delegation had 35 fossil fuel lobbyists and interest, having an official Canada badge. So that's really shameful, and that's something we should totally be outraged on. And I think that's what also is making this conference feel less and less interesting to people, is people are thinking, well, how can it go forward in a good way with these folks present? So I think, again, it's about not saying it's a perfect conference, but saying that in many ways it's the one we have. Let's seek to improve it, and let's seek to use it. Again, it's really on us as civil society to make a good use of it. So what happened? We can go to the next slide. One big win, I guess, of this COP is that there was a loss and damage fund that was established. I'll be sharing those slides after, so all those small numbers that none of us can read right now, you'll be able to look at and zoom in on. But let me explain to you what the loss and damage fund is, and then we can talk about the bar chart very quickly. The loss and damage fund has been asked for by poor countries for decades, and most of these countries are in the global south. They've been arguing that they did not cause climate change, that industrialized countries, developed countries in UN parlance, have created the bulk of, have emitted the bulk of the emissions that are now causing the climate change we're already seeing. But a lot of these poor countries are suffering from it firsthand. We're seeing terrible fires right now in Chile. We're seeing, we've seen, flash floods across South Asia last year. And so a lot of these countries are saying, not only did we not get rich causing the problem, now we're being very impacted, suffering from it. And so they asked for a fund that would cover their loss and damage. Now, human life is not even quantified in this loss and damage. And so we shouldn't even think that this is a full justice. But this gets a bit towards, redistribution and justice, and saying, if we got rich from creating pollution, we should actually share some of that wealth back to the people who are now suffering from it. And that was really the premise. And this year it got adopted or established, and countries started pitching in. You might not be able to see, but I'll just let you know that unfortunately Canada's contribution for now is very, very, very small. It's over there. They're contributing in other ways. Here you have some of the other funds that they're contributing to. But for such a big country that exports so much fossil fuels, we should really be doing more. And, you have countries like France that have put a lot more. So just a point here that it might be something we want to advocate for is for international justice and solidarity. We can go to the next slide. And I'm rushing through big concepts. I'm happy to go through them in more depth as we have questions. But this kind of gives you an overview, and then we can select which topics are more of interest to you. So the big takeaway from COP was what are countries going to do as we are 5 years, or I'll just answer the questions after, but those are great questions. What did countries do once they took stock of what had happened since the Paris Agreement? So this past year, they were supposed to all take stock. Let's look at what we did. How far are we from the goals? And the scientists were saying we're not doing very well. We're doing better than what we thought we would be, which was a terrible 5 degrees of warming, but we're still very far from our goals. And so countries were supposed to find a solution to that. And after a lot of a fight, and after things that were going in all directions, we did get this final text that says countries are agreeing to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems and accelerate climate action in this critical decade. This was unseen, and I know for us, it seems quite commonplace to say that we need to transition away from the main source of climate change, but it was very difficult because it admits that we are now going to have to be, transition away is a very nice way to say phase down, or some of us would even say phase out of fossil fuels. So this was key. This was a big fight, and this is something we need to be using now domestically. Because if our governments and companies are still planning to expand fossil fuels, while we just signed an international agreement saying transition away from, there's a mismatch. I will say that another, important win in there was that there is now a goal for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that's important because we can't keep talking about what we're getting away from without having a clear idea of what we're going into. So let's talk about the phase in of renewables, the phase in of energy efficiency. And it's really good to see that we now have this global goal. We have a bit of math to do to think, well, what is Canada's goal? Because maybe ours isn't triple renewables. Maybe ours is way more because we have more capacity for renewables. So there's a bit of adapting that we need to do. But overall, this is obviously a really positive step that countries took. There were big red flags, though, in that text. One of the big red flags was that you'll notice it says transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. And so one of the things we started seeing this COP, which we hadn't seen before, is how much the fossil fuel industry is starting to promote fossil fuel beyond combustion as a solution. So plastic, that's plastic. We can make everything plastic, or we can make everything carbon fiber. And not that, some of these products aren't important, but the way they're promoting it makes it sound like we don't have to stop production or reduce production or prepare for reducing production. We'll just find alternative usage. And that's very dangerous politically because it could lead to delays in transition plans because we're told that we have other outlets for all that fossil fuel. Another big red flag was how much carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies were promoted everywhere as the solution. Some people had reasonable estimates saying we'll need it a bit in, hard to decarbonize sectors. But some people were really saying it'll be a way for us to keep ramping up production of fossil fuels. So something we really have to be in tune to, and our politicians in Canada are really, honestly in love with the concept of carbon capture. We really have to push back on that and remind them of the facts, which is that carbon capture is absolutely unproven at the scale that we need, and it's economically way more expensive than ramping up renewables and actually going for energy efficiency. And then we saw a big promotion of so-called natural gas or fossil gas as a transition fuel. That is a key theme that we saw throughout COP, which I was very afraid about. And so with all that in mind, we can go to the next slide to look at what Canada, let's touch on this one quickly, just because since COP, so COP ended mid-December, two big things happened, and I can't prove that they happened thanks to COP, but I wondered as I saw them, is this a direct result from the COP decision to transition away? The first one, that Biden actually hit pause on a lot of natural gas projects because he wants to look into their climate implications before moving them forward. This is huge. I mean, the natural gas industry really has managed to capture a lot of the minds of politicians. And so that was a very big news. The fossil fuel industry is outraged by this Biden decision, and we have to think perhaps that international consensus helped. And then the other one, big surprise, is Saudi Arabia actually announcing, sure, they're not announcing a phase out of fossil fuels, but they're saying we might not do all the expansion we were planning on doing. That again is a really good signal that the tide is shifting. Something there is happening, that these fossil fuel countries who had their entire next economic plans based on fossil fuel expansion are rethinking it. So just a bit of hope, maybe also something to capitalize on for us. Yeah, so we can go to the next slide now. Very briefly, this is my colleagues and I at COP. We had our cheeky emissions caps on. So as you know, the federal government in Canada has promised to put a cap on oil and gas emissions. And so a really clever person in one of our partner organizations thought that we should all go to COP with a cap that had emissions on it. And it was a success. Let me just tell you, the entire civil society from across the world knew that we were Canadians because we would come in with our emissions cap. So very clever tactic, and turned out the timing was good for this cheeky tactic, because the environment minister actually announced the framework for the oil and gas emissions cap at COP. This isn't yet the actual cap they announced. They just announced, I guess, the blueprint, what they're initially thinking, and they opened a consultation. And we'll talk about it later in the action of the day, but this consultation is just wrapping up, but they're still very much open to hearing more from Canadians on this cap. And so this was obviously good news that this is moving forward. Other announcements, which we don't have to get into detail because honestly, they're quite nerdy and a bit long overdue, but things like methane regulations actually were announced. There's a big problem of methane leaks and methane, flaring in a bunch of oil and gas production facilities. So it's very important that we just regulate. That's like low-hanging fruit. It wouldn't ask a lot by industry, and methane is a huge contributor to climate change in the short term. Also positive was that Canada was actually saying, yes, we want to talk about phase out. That was a surprise to us. Now, there's always loopholes. They're saying phase out of fossil fuels that isn't compensated by carbon capture. But it was very positive to see the minister wanting to be a leader and seen as a leader on it. And then we noticed that this year there was no fossil fuel presentation hosted at the Canada Pavilion. That wasn't the case last year. Last year, the Canada Pavilion was hosting several fossil fuel interest groups to showcase their work. And they were met with a lot of backlash from our colleagues that went last year, and this year there were none. So that was positive. The negative, as I mentioned, the big one, is the 35 fossil fuel lobbyists that have an official Canada badge as they attend COP, as they walk around. And that, hugely concerning. But when we asked the minister's team about it, we were told that actually Canada didn't necessarily want to do that. It was the provinces that recommended those people. And it was Alberta and Saskatchewan specifically that demanded these badges. And so we're getting into a theme that we need to think about in Canada, which is there's a growing divide between the ambitions of our federal government on climate and what Alberta, Saskatchewan, many other provinces are trying to do here. And they're really standing in the way of climate progress. And I was almost ashamed at COP to have our own internal divides showing up so clearly. For example, Saskatchewan set up its own pavilion, even though Canada had a pavilion. I didn't see any other, state in the US or any other region from somewhere else have its own pavilion on top of the country's pavilion. And so on the next slide, I just want to tell you a bit more about this strange new thing we saw about Alberta and Saskatchewan showing up as, individual entities and trying to separate themselves from what Canada was doing in this international setting. Very odd and very worrisome, actually. Alberta came with a big delegation. The Alberta Premier actually came, and they came to do presentations. They came to show a lot of support for the fossil fuel industry. They came to sell this idea that you could have climate-friendly oil and gas. That was really the key message that was coming out of their entire delegation. And they were met with a lot of opposition from international civil society and from us, from Canadian civil society. On the international stage, this is a fun thing that you might not know about COP, is that every single night, international civil society, so like, whatever the equivalent of an environmental defense is in Norway and Korea and everywhere else, all kind of come together at lunch every day, and we vote on who the fossils of the day are, meaning who are the countries that stood in the way of progress today at COP. And international society made an exception for us. They said, normally, we don't give a fossil of the day to non-state entities. But Alberta is so disruptive to this conference that we're actually giving Alberta a fossil of the day. And that was quite significant to be called out on the international stage. And then you see on the right that we were there with some of the nations most impacted by the tar sands to also counter some of the greenwashing narrative. But so this dynamic here was kind of the thing I wanted to end on, because at the end of the day, whatever happens at COP is going to be so influenced by our domestic policy. And that's why it's so important that we really pay attention to what's happening back home, because our minister can't go and be super ambitious abroad if back home he's going to be met with a lot of backlash. And so that's, something we need to figure out is how we try to help address these barriers that even politicians who maybe want to lean in more to climate ambition really can't because of this opposition. So I'm mindful of time. I'll just maybe pause here on the COP aspect and take a little breath, because I spoke very fast at you. But I hope that you had key themes there that you want to dig into. And maybe we can switch to talking a bit more around how I got to this work, who I am a bit more, and maybe some thoughts on where youth activism is at now. So we can go to the next slide. Yes, and actually, we'll just go to the next one right away. Thank you. Actually, drink in the meantime. So we'll stay on this slide as I explain this. I think it's just a lovely reminder of just how much, even in the last few years, there's been mobilization in the streets. And this is just the last few years. There's, of course, decades of climate organizing. And we're really just walking in the footsteps of people that have done this before us. But I wanted to share with you, and I was invited to do that by the hosts of today, a bit of my backstory and a bit of my journey to activism, because as I mentioned at the top, it might help us identify, okay, these are types of things we might want to do more often in terms of how to empower youth, so that we have more, climate activists, we have more people who can take up this fight. So in my case, I think that the things that really made me go from being concerned, perhaps even anxious about it, to actually finding a way to be active, is really finding adults along the way, along me growing up, that gave me tools that I was able to use to advocate, but really at my scale. So I'll give you an example. I was around 10 years old. I started getting concerned around things like human rights and environmental issues, because you're hearing about them. You're thinking, that sounds very unfortunate. Animals are hurting. You're hearing these notions. And I really appreciated that both, my parents and some of the educators in my life, I'm remembering my school librarian as one of them, said, okay, why don't you do a project about it and present it to us? Okay, now why don't you give us 5 recommendations of what we could do? And so you see, I pointed out, because they didn't tell me, we're going to go and put you on TV talking about it, it's so cute. They said, no, let's show you what you could do to first change your very close environment. And then, they encouraged me to try to change that first. And as I was able to grow up, I started thinking, okay, well, now how do I ask my school administration to change? And then how do I, going into high school, is there something a bit more? Starting to write to your members of parliament, or back in France, to elected representatives. And this very gradual progress allowed me to, solidify my opinions in a very safe space. No cameras, no trying to not trying to make it a celebrity child, but actually thinking, figure out what's important to you, figure out what are the ways you have power, and then start expanding. But then, of course, what really changed for me was I was in university at the University of Toronto. I was very concerned about climate change. I think I was leaning more and more into the real deep eco-anxiety, eco-grief. I was really starting to think, okay, we're really not doing well. And two things happened. Greta Thunberg in Sweden started striking and doing her school climate strikes. And back in Toronto, there's a group of adults who started saying, we'd like to empower youth to do what Greta is doing. The folks from the group Climate Fast or from 350 Toronto, they actually started saying, we want to support youth. And they did. They ended up, I met them, there are a few other young people that met them. And it's really with their guidance, it's with their support that, they started teaching us things like deputing to City Hall, or how to ask Queen's Park for a permit to do a protest. And it was quite literally these very practical ways of supporting that actually allowed me to lean into this activism. And so I point this out because I think when we think about youth activism, we kind of hope that youth are just going to emerge as activists somehow, just going to pop out. But actually, for me, it was intergenerational organizing that made it even conceivable to take the risk of, hosting a protest and asking for people to come. And I hope we can keep doing that. I hope we can really think about how are adults who have done this for many times before on many causes, how can they be there and offer help when needed, but then have the wisdom of stepping back when they see that the youth, have it under control. And I think that the people in my life certainly were able to do that in a very, mindful way. And so that was what I hope we can keep doing for others. And it's what I'm trying to do now for others, is not, telling them exactly what they have to do, but at key moments, supporting them. And with that, maybe a little final thought on where we are at in youth activism. Unfortunately, we're in a bit of a low. Oh, we can go back to the previous one. Thank you. We're in a bit of a low moment. The pictures you're seeing here, there's 2018, 2019, you see the masks, so there's also 2020, 2021. We have since seen, especially with the pandemic, that all the campus groups, all the high school networks, because people were offline or online for so long and not together, a lot of these groups didn't have transition plans. People from grade 12 graduate and we don't know who else to contact. People from university graduate and we don't have any group. And so we are in a bit of a low point on youth climate mobilization. There's a few very strong voices out there that are excellent, but they're a bit alone and they're getting really tired, and they're also slowly growing out of it. And so one thing I would invite us to think about is how maybe, again, this intergenerational support could come in, and how do we find, again, those people who have been trying to find a way to speak up, but still don't have the tools. I think, for me, it was certainly the case that I had the desire, I just didn't know where to put the energy. And so that's a bit where we're at. And then remembering that I don't think when we think of engaging youth on climate action, we should simply think about creating, many adults out of youth. Like I'm always a bit taken aback when we just create another youth climate policy committee or, things like that. I think we need to also go to youth for what youth are best at. And it's not necessarily policy formulation or long consultations. It's what's the creativity they bring. What's, youth are trendsetters. They're already ambassadors of a cause. So I think, thinking through what are the strategic ways that youth should be engaged instead of just trying to bring them into places where we need like a young person with us because it looks good would be kind of an interesting.
It did it for 1 second.
Oh, I don't know who I'm hearing, but
Can everyone
It's not
please
worth
mute?
this.
Yeah, could everyone please mute? Thank you.
thank you. Well, anyways, we're getting towards the moment where it'd be nice to open it up to you.
Yeah. I was ready.
I'm hearing Patricia.
And you know, it's 53 minutes.
Perhaps the host can help us with them. There we go. Thank you. So yes, to wrap it up, and again, mindful of how much I spoke, but I think I'd really like I know I see so many questions, would love to hear from you. And also I hope this can be an invitation, of course, in the future to keep thinking about how we can keep finding those young people who I think desperately really want to act, but have, you know, the activist pipeline that used to happen on campuses and in school settings has kind of broken during COVID, and it's a bit of a setback for the movement, and we have to find another way to connect with them now. So yes, I'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much, and we can have a conversation.
So, Allie, thank you for that absolutely informative, insightful, and inspirational presentation. It was fantastic. You somehow managed to deliver a positive message at a time when so many of us are tending toward a somewhat pessimistic view of the world. You've been realistic about where our focus should be in the years ahead and encouraging about the power and determination of a new generation of activists coming of age at what is a difficult time. And now Allie has very generously agreed to stay and answer some of our questions, and there are many, many, many of them. So I don't know how much time we have, but we'll get started. Okay, so I'm going to start with the questions about COP. Okay, and I just want to dig into something that you said about whether COP is really consensus based, and this is a question from David Smith. But the question is, do all participating countries have to agree to the final results?
That's a tricky one, right? Yes, technically, on paper they do. And so on paper, if someone said, no, I object, I don't want this, then we would stop. However, the reality is there's obviously diplomatic considerations. A country might think, oh, this wasn't good enough, but I did get this bilateral agreement with one of these countries who would be really upset if I put my hand up. And so just like, you know, in any of our group conversations, when we reach a consensus, there's other dynamics at play. But on paper, a single country could actually stop the whole progress. Just likely they would get a lot of diplomatic backlash if they did, but, you know, so would you and I in a meeting. So
theoretically,
yes.
they could.
Yes. And I think if there was something catastrophic, a country could absolutely raise their hand and say no, but diplomatic considerations come into play. And I think I don't think any process could avoid that, because countries, of course, are constantly negotiating on many, many things at once. And I should have mentioned from the get-go, we were having this COP in the Middle East at a time where there's obviously extreme levels of violence in the Middle East. That came up a lot in negotiations, and different alliances were, of course, mentioning that and thinking about that as we were having these dialogues.
Okay, thank you. And Scan Ottawa and David Smith again, we're asking about NGOs at COP. How do we get more NGOs to attend COP, next COP? And this time, did the federal government ask any climate activists to be official delegates? Does that happen?
Yeah, so Canada has a pretty good presence of NGOs at COP, I find, and also a good presence of labor unions. Very impressive to see a large amount of labor unions send many delegates. Not the case of many countries. So Canada has a pretty active civil society, especially for our size. I think the question should be less, can we send more ENGOs to COP? It's very costly. It's taking a lot of capacity. But maybe how do we make sure that those people are best used and best supported? So making sure that while we send, if we only send, I don't know, a few people there, we should have maybe 2 or 3 times as many organizers back home holding the protest, informing local media, so that we can give the people there the power they need, right? Like, it's way easier for me to be at COP and say, Minister, did you know yesterday there were 20,000 people in Ottawa saying this? Will you announce XYZ? if there's no one back home thinking about it, the pressure is not there. So it's more than sending more. It's sending them better and sending better equipped people. I will say, and that's in all honesty, I'm always careful about how to share this, but there is a bit of a tendency by some folks to do COP tourism, which is I go to COP, I don't yet know what I'm going to do there. I don't have a plan. I don't know who I'm going to talk to and influence, but I wanted to show that I was at COP. And I think we should be quite critical of that because we're taking away important badges, important resources, important, time. So we should not start making it, the Met Gala of climate activists. It should really still be a strategic thing, and there's a tendency to slip there. And for your second question, yes, NGOs did get badges. Sometimes we choose not to. Environmental Defense chooses to be accredited separately because it gives us total freedom to say whatever we want to say, and that's really our value added, is often to say what no one else wants to say. But some really important activists, I'm thinking about people from Climate Action Network, they are part of the official delegation because they follow closely negotiations and have more of an advisory role to the negotiation team. And we have more of the accountability role on the outside.
Okay. And Larry Newfield just added another related question, which is, can anybody go to COP? You mentioned that it was strange to see individual provinces from Canada attending.
Yeah, it's funny that I like the way you asked that, because sometimes I was walking around saying, they really let anybody in here. Like, there's no standard, but that's not true. You absolutely have to be accredited. There's two ways you can get accredited: applying through the UN, and there you have to show that you have a value added. So for environmental defense, we had to show, we've been years of activists, like showing, we have expertise, we have members, showing you add value, or through a country, in which case it's just your country that decides whether you're worth inviting or not. So in the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, it was Canada that granted them a badge. You can imagine it would be politically difficult for them to refuse a badge to elected leadership from some of the provinces.
Okay, I don't mean to harp on this, but I'm really curious. Is there, the NGOs get together at some point and say, okay, this is our role, this is their role?
Yeah.
Before COP?
Yes,
Yeah.
we do a lot of that. And again, like,
Okay.
groups like Climate Action Network play a big role there. We go in saying, what's international civil society's goal, first of all? Like, the loss and damage was an international civil society goal. And then what's Canada's, and what are our key things? And we try to coordinate as best we can. Yeah. There's a lot of pre-COP work that goes, if anything, COP, like, it's intense on the ground because you're just running around, but actually the few weeks before feel way more intense in terms of brain power that you're putting into it.
Okay, good to hear. And the next question is related to the presence of the oil and gas lobby. First of all, how can we most effectively counter the influence of that lobby at COP and in government generally? Yeah, or should there be, this is from Christy McCallum, should there be an effort to reduce the presence of oil representatives?
Yeah, like, that is a very big topic that I think at Environmental Defense we've started to prioritize way more, realizing that you can make the case for good policy all you want. If you are met with a counterforce that has maybe 30 times your budget, maybe 100 times your budget and your capacity, you won't work. So we're now trying to really strategically target that influence. At COP itself, we are hoping that the UN will continue making progress on this conflict of interest clause. I think that's important. However, we can do quite a good job advocating to our respective countries. So to me, it was striking that the Environment Minister's office was very quick to clarify all those Canada badges that were given to fossil fuel lobbyists. They weren't from us. They were from Alberta and Saskatchewan, who put them on the list. And, we agreed because these are Canadian levels of government. So, for example, that means that for them, it was politically dangerous to be seen as giving out fossil fuel interest badges. So keeping to, make that a standard, I think would help. That still, like that question of how we reduce their influence domestically and internationally, one of the key things is really exposing them as corporate interests. And in many ways, people sometimes confuse people who work for the industry with the executives and the lobbyists of the industry. And we really try to make the difference between someone who has chosen to pursue a job in the industry because they needed a job, that's a local job that pays your, mortgage or rent, and that's kind of a decision, that's that, versus a person who is a C-level executive or a lobbyist who chooses every day to make decisions that are going to delay climate action. Very different, and we're trying to distinguish the two. And two fun things that we're starting to try. The first one is if you go to climatevillains.ca, you will find, I don't know if you've ever seen this website, climatevillains.ca, you will find that we've started to actually show who the top negative influences on climate action are. And those are mostly CEOs or executive directors or chair people of a lot of fossil fuel organizations. And we've started basically to look at their behavior and say, in interviews, what do they constantly say? And, so that's one way, is to start showing that these are individuals. This isn't an external force mysteriously, delaying climate action. These are everyday people who go to work and make the decision to delay. The other one is we've also started tracking how much they lobby. So my colleague Emilia on our team is tracking every single month. There's an official lobbying registry of who lobbies the federal government. And every single month she takes the data and she looks at it and she says who was lobbied, by who, how, and I can also send afterwards the website but she does a monthly blog where she says, in March, on average per working day, the fossil fuel industry lobbied the federal government 4 times or 6 times, or, per working day. And so already exposing that, for a while there was a bit of lack of accountability. A minister could take all the meetings he wanted with the fossil fuel industry because no one was going to notice. Now we're making sure that that minister is noticed, is called out for being the person who met the most with the fossil fuel industry, for example. Those are small ways. And maybe just 2 things I'll point out briefly. 2 days ago, a member of parliament, MP Charlie Angus, actually tabled a bill that would put strong restrictions on fossil fuel advertising. I don't have time to go into all the details, but it's worth digging into more of basically saying they've misled the public for many years. This needs to be banned, just like you can't advertise the health benefits of a cigarette. You just can't do that. That's not legal. This would be the same thing. And the last thing I'll say is more and more people are doing official complaints to the Competition Bureau saying, hey, this is misleading advertising from the fossil fuel industry. When Enbridge says switching to gas is cheaper than anything else, that's not true, because a heat pump would have been cheaper, but they didn't say that. So more and more, like Environmental Defense has a few Competition Bureau complaints, Greenpeace, many others, Eco Justice, all these organizations are doing Competition Bureau complaints. There's many more things we could do, I think. If we have ideas, we're open to them.
Yeah, or a lot of money.
A lot of money would help. If you have millions, also feel free to send them our way.
Good. Okay. And a question from a couple of people is how much greenwashing took place? Did you see, people who were pushing things like carbon capture and or people who wanted to use natural gas as a transition fuel, that kind of thing? Was that really prevalent?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's kind of the new stage of denial that we're seeing, is not saying there's no climate change. Some people are trying to say it's going to be not too harmful, but that's even harder to make the case because of so many climate victims being out there now. So now the new stage is saying it's real, but we have solutions that don't imply at all touching fossil fuel production. And so that was a key. For example, in Canada, we have the Pathways Alliance, which is the largest, oil sands producers and some major gas producers. coming together, and it's really a greenwashing alliance in the sense that their sole purpose is to advocate for clean oil and gas from Canada. They were very present. We saw also a few other of these industry type groups have official pavilions in different venues, and having a whole set of programming for the 2 weeks about all the wonderful solutions just for Canada. I can't even mention how many from abroad there were, but it's very present, and it's especially striking to me that several official politicians were speaking side by side with these industry groups, and I think, of course, the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was there really on what we ended up calling a greenwashing tour, because that's how it came across. Truly, it was a total denial of the impacts and a strong emphasis on what could be in terms of clean oil and gas, which is absolutely unproven.
Okay, last question on COP before we get to youth activism. I hope I've left enough time for that. Were you aware of any connections being made between militarism and climate emissions? War is very destructive to the environment, and preparation for war and execution of war takes a lot of money that we could use much better for climate action. Related to that, these are questions from Lynn Adamson. Was nuclear energy portrayed as a climate solution, and how did the CANREC delegation members or youth delegates respond to this?
Okay, yeah,
I
those
know,
are
very big.
No, those are super interesting, and I have to say, now that we're here, that Lynn was for sure one of those folks in the early stages of me getting active that really gave me a ramp so that I could not, crash and burn in my early activism. So thanks, Lynn. On the militarism, it's true that it's not a topic that's in any way front and center. I think we've seen a few advocates specifically trying to bring it up in, for example, the minister hosts every few days at COP a briefing with anybody from Canada civil society and says, do you have any questions for me about the negotiations? And a few people raised their hand and brought up militarism, brought up what was happening in Palestine, brought up what was the other question, nuclear. Like, these things are there, they're brought up. I wouldn't say that they're getting a spotlight in any stronger way. I think in many ways I've noticed that from civil society there's perhaps just no one has had the time to really do a deep dive. And so I think oftentimes people are struggling with, yes, I'll show up to this action, or I'll sign up to this at COP, because they weren't necessarily sure where their organization back home stood, right? So that was key dynamic. I would say militarism was brought up more because of the geopolitical context we were in and the region we were in. So it was brought up more, but not substantially. Nuclear, yes, very big presence of the nuclear industry. I have to tell you, I had never seen so many. There was a lot of young people, young engineers that were sent there by the nuclear industry wearing shirts that had I love nuclear kind of things. I can't remember the slogan. They were all wearing the same branded shirt, all young engineers. I spoke to a few of them that were there to promote the nuclear industry, and there ended up being an agreement on nuclear that Canada signed on to, and a few other countries around. It might be tripling nuclear capacity. I'm not sure. I can't remember the timeline for some reason, but so that was happening. It didn't feel like front and center, but in many ways Canada was very engaged in it. And again, just like the plastic industry, you're seeing other interests now come into the COP world, realizing there's this shift happening with fossil fuel phase out. A lot of people are thinking, how can I get in on whatever void is being left there? So yeah, good.
You say that Canada signed an agreement on
Yeah.
nuclear. Was it with other specific countries? I'm assuming the side deal. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I think it's more of a pledge at this point to triple nuclear capacity. I'll have to check. It might be by 2030, which seems unlikely given the timelines for a nuclear industry. But I'll have to check, or 2050 perhaps. I'll check on that. Sorry about not having the timeline, but I know that France signed on to it, and France being a big proponent of nuclear. And it might be about, at least 30 other countries signed on to it. It happened kind of one day. We were very caught off guard, and then it kind of vanished because the focus was back on transition language. But there was that side announcement that was made, and that was probably something countries had planned to do ahead of time. I don't think that was necessarily the host country that was fully proactively, trying to promote that aspect.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now to more general questions and questions about youth activism. You mentioned that you felt that youth activism was at a low point after the pandemic and other setbacks. What do you think senior climate activists, which many of your audience right now are, what can we do to support them in their work? We tend to have more time, often more resources.
Yeah, I mean, again, pointing out that many times before we've actually seen seniors show up and really help youth activists. I like the youth climate strikes in Toronto, the Fridays for Future strikes benefited so much from people having extra capacity, and it's from things as quote unquote simple as, hey, I have a van, do you need me to transport the stage? That's thing as complicated as, I'll help you think through the safety strategy of your entire protest. So and I'll help you think through your demands. So I've seen all of this. I think that kind of open offer, saying, hey, this is the skills I have, these are the connections I have, and offering them to the youth groups or to different youth that you're seeing active, saying, it's you don't have to take them. I'm not imposing that. I'm not telling you this is what you need to focus on, but these are the skills I have. I'm very good at these applications, these things, I can do this. Give me a call when you need it. I think that's always very appreciated. I also think that I've really been appreciating the amount of activism and organizing that's been done by seniors groups. I think it's almost giving youth a moment to breathe and reconvene because someone else is also holding down the fort at the same time. It's really helpful and really comforting to have a moment to step back because you don't think nothing is going to happen in the public sphere. But I'll be honest with you, I'm still struggling to figure out how, and especially as someone that's no longer on campuses, how we go back into connecting with them. It seems to me like now more and more young people are getting, politicized through social media. And that's something that a lot of us aren't necessarily used to like really targeting. So I think we'll have to work more and more with communications experts on finding them on social media, even though the activism then might be again in the streets, but getting them from that place is now where we have to reach them. And then, I mean, young people, again, in my case and in other cases, like often it's through the adults in our lives. And so going to educators, equipping educators with the right resources, having teachers or librarians know what to say when a young person comes to you and says, I'm terrified of the climate crisis. Let's not tell them, oh, don't worry. Or, oh, there's nothing we can do. Like having someone know, these are the groups that you could go to. This is how you write to your MP. I think having that touch point to me changed everything. And I hope we would have, all educators equipped to properly respond. And sometimes I kind of joke that it's almost like, sex ed, where you would have to have educators that know how to respond and not say something completely silly to a kid that's asking. This is the same thing. Don't tell them something that's going to, put them in a totally vulnerable position. So that would be maybe my advice. If you have connections to those people playing education roles, counseling roles, there's so many touch points in kids' lives. Also through hobbies. I mean, how many kids will first confess climate anxiety or climate grief to someone who, is maybe their sports coach or, their music teacher, right? Someone else than their parents, because maybe they don't think their parents are going to be super in tune to a climate concerned kid.
Okay, and that leads to, I think, the last question that I have time for, or that we have time for. So a lot of people identify climate as a high priority concern, when they're asked, but the issue tends to fall behind when people face pocketbook issues like inflation and other major issues, healthcare, things like that. Do you have any advice on how we could communicate more effectively with the general public?
Yeah, big question. I think we're still trying to grapple with it, honestly, at environmental defense. One of the things we need is politicians to be better at actually proposing policies, climate policies that are progressive and equitable. Sometimes I feel like I can't defend a government's track record if I actually don't think the solution is equitable either. So there is a big part, which is, and we might have an election coming up within the next year to 2 years. Would all policy platforms be able to articulate equitable climate policies? Energy efficiency is also very good for savings, and excellent for addressing climate change. So really, just first of all, getting actual policies that we can then promote as progressive, because they are. But also, I think we need to better communicate ways in which maybe for some of us, climate action has already been more affordable. So, if we could have more and more testimonies or pieces saying, climate action made my life more affordable because I did this. Because it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. People hear climate action is going to be expensive. And so then they try to find that in their life. But if they hear the opposite, climate action has been my life less expensive, or my life more enjoyable, maybe it's not about money, it's about time or about something else, then they'll start realizing that in their life. So it's a lot of personal, individual stories of how I personally, was able to find a sense of fulfillment, a sense of this, a sense of that through or with climate change. So I would just encourage us maybe not to think of it as a purely communications thing, or you just have to rebrand a carbon tax as, something, but maybe more thinking about actually giving people very clear pointers as to how this has already been the case for some people, and therefore it could be you too if you advocated for it, if your city decided to do it, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in one last question because I really like this one. I'm sorry. David Smith asks, do you have a favorite climate scientist? I'd love to hear your answer on this. I think we would all like this.
That's a good question. A favorite climate scientist? Well, it's tough for me because climate scientists than maybe climate communicators as a whole, or political. She's not squarely climate, but I think she's very interesting. Her name is Kate Raworth. She wrote Donut Economics. She's not climate per se, but the way she has decided to try to, I like her for her work, but I also like her for the approach she's taken, which is, I'm an Oxford level thinker, and yet I'm going to create content that's so accessible that people who did not go to Oxford at all are able to, see an interest in what she does. So for her, it was around, what she calls donut economics. So making sure we're both meeting minimum conditions for humans to live in without exceeding the thresholds of our planet. And that idea of the donut is very visual. But what I appreciated was she really went, I think, the extra mile. She probably spent more time thinking about the exact analogy to communicate it than writing her actual thesis initially. So just for that, I find her very inspiring. But I'll think of more climate scientists and follow up with Dave.
Thank you. That's great. A good choice, I think, for most of us. Okay, so Allie will now present an action of the day related to the oil and gas cap. Now, some of us have already weighed in on this issue and this set of regulations, thinking that, okay, that's it, we're finished, but we're not finished. The battle continues. So Allie will now present the action of the day.
Sure, and I think we'll have a little slide for you to see. Perfect. So just as a reminder, now over 2 years ago, the oil and gas lobby, no, not the oil and gas lobby, That's an interesting connection I made in my brain. The federal government promised a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sectors. That's a cap on all greenhouse gases coming from the oil and gas sector. So methane, carbon dioxide, other gases. It said we're going to cap it at a certain level, and then we're going to have that cap progressively decrease in order to decrease emissions from this sector. It is really important for us. Like, this is a key policy. It falls under federal jurisdiction because the federal government can regulate pollution. It can't regulate production levels, but it can regulate pollution. And it's really important because the oil and gas sector is the one that keeps increasing its emissions when the rest of the country is doing pretty well at starting to slowly decrease. So really big, climate win there if we manage to make it work. However, as you might have expected, the NGO threatened about it and has launched, honestly, a very big effort to avoid this emissions cap. We've seen, you must be familiar with the idea of astroturf groups. We have seen the emergence of these fake grassroots community groups coming up at record levels with really high levels of funding in terms of ability to do ads. So huge pushback. So what I'm inviting you to do here is that the government right now hasn't yet tabled its emissions cap. It's still thinking about it, and we have I'll put the action also in the chat as I have it, but we have this letter that you can send, and you can modify the letter if you want to add more details, especially always good to add more about who you are and why you care. Send this letter to ask for a strong emissions cap that actually limits and then reduces emissions. I'll be sure to share the link now as we go. And just so you know, you might have seen that the consultation on it ended on the 5th. The official consultation did, but you are entitled to speak to your elected officials at all times. And up until, this policy is final and in place, you should be informing how you want to see it. And even once it's in place, we should be criticizing it if it's bad. So don't limit yourself to the official consultation period. You can comment anytime. I'll just find the link while I pass the mic back.
Thank you again, Allie. That was, so wonderful. And there's lots of love coming to you in the chat. And now I'm going to turn things over to Michael Barkley to say a few words about upcoming events.
Hi, folks. We wanted to tell you about a little bit about the 3 subgroups that we have. We call them interest groups. Individual action is pretty much a group that gets together to talk about what we can do ourselves or within our circle of family and friends. Past efforts of that group have included information on home retrofits, on heat pump installations, recycling systems, carbon offsets and what they really mean, whether they're worth it, measuring our carbon footprints, and a whole number of other sort of individual related actions. Currently, efforts are focused on how we can make improvements in our condo living and multi-residential rental homes. So you're invited to join this group. Climate advocacy is another one of our interest groups. And here we try to take, the group tries to look for opportunities for influencing public policy and corporate behavior, and looking to work with other civil society groups on advocacy. And that's a good portion of what that group is engaged in, is how can we ally with other organizations to add our voices. Currently, we have 2 work groups that are looking at Ontario's energy system and how to make it more sustainable and carbon free. While the second group is looking at climate messaging, studying an American initiative from Potential Energy, which is really quite interesting in how we talk about climate change to the general public or to our friends or relatives. And also Reclimate, which is a climate messaging sort of think tank at Carleton University. And we're kind of working through the materials from those 2 organizations to try to figure out how we can communicate better and how we can influence other organizations to think about that. So you can feel free to join any of these groups by emailing contact.us@climatelearners.ca. And the last interest group we have is a nature-based solutions, where there are periodic meetings of this group to discuss protection of our natural world's biodiversity. And the group also spends a lot of time outdoors to appreciate what we have in order to urge us to advocate for the natural world around us. There will be more information coming about Earth Week in April 22nd during that week, with nature-based solutions taking the lead. So there'll be information on our website about that. And lastly, our next monthly meeting, which is March 6th at 10 a.m., it's going to be a little bit different of a learning meeting. Well, we try to explore amongst ourselves how we're feeling about our personal reactions to the world of climate change, about what's happening around us, about the issues that we read about every day. We want to move from a more sort of static learning environment that we usually do to exploring with each other the personal impact of what this learning is having on us. We want to take a look at whether this makes us anxious, whether we're concerned about it, whether we're hopeful. We're going to break into small groups on Zoom so we can chat within that smaller group and talk about our hopes and fears as we journey together, trying to look for solutions for the future generations. And then we'll end that session on March 6th with a number of hopeful stories that people have been submitting, so that we can see what's happening around the world to make change that is positive and useful for the future. These stories have really been pouring in from you, the call supporters, and we really look forward to using this kind of check-in with each other, see how we're doing, and see what the hopeful future can be, so that we don't get stuck in the sort of negative media world where we sometimes can be stuck. So that's sort of where we're headed, and I think that probably brings us to the end. And joining, we can continue this conversation. We always have an after chat after each one of these meetings. I'll pass it back.
And I think our guest said she'd stay for a few minutes. Allie?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. But don't let me keep the mic. I'd love to hear from others.
A quick question. I noticed that China and Russia, are they involved in the finances?
Yeah, they're a interesting one. China likes to still attempt to be seen as not one of the wealthy or developed countries. At the same time, we know they're obviously made big progress. So I need to check exactly the numbers, but overall they try to, it oscillates a bit. Russia is not one of the main contributors at COP most of the time, honestly. But China tends to be very active on all things related to technology transfers because they're so big on renewables. So they're more present there, I would say, than on the loss and damage, where I think they would consider themselves not one of the historic, polluters.
Can I ask a question about just transition, Allie? I was meeting with retired teachers and the Shift group yesterday. We've been working a couple of years on the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan investments. And one thing that we talked about was the lack of unionized jobs in the renewable energy sector and how that's making just transition more of a challenge. What can groups like us do to encourage unionization in renewable energy jobs so that we can attract fossil fuel industry workers into them, to transition into them?
Yeah, that's such a smart question. It's really like one of the key things we keep telling people. There's jobs in the renewables, and there are many jobs. There's a net job gain. But if these jobs aren't unionized, then people are going from being protected by collective bargaining to just like you're and your employer. And so I think that's a really good question. Some of the things we could ask for by government is that, whenever they're going to do they love giving out investment tax credits. Like, you know,
Right.
they love, the government spends a lot of money trying to encourage clean energy. We should be asking that there's conditions to that money. And one of the conditions should be, perhaps we can't exactly ask for conditions that there is a union already, but non-obstruction to, you know, unionization is at least a minimum. So one of those things, or asking that there's a percentage of that has to go to unionized workplaces. So that's a big one, is like where the government money goes. And Biden did that for sure in the US, right? With his IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, where he said, you'll get, you know, I don't know, 10% off your taxes if you are a clean energy project bill. You get 15% off if you're a unionized one. So, you know, clear favoring of there. On the other end, I think we should do a better job, and that's like a we that very much includes me. We're not that much in touch with the renewable energy world and industry. They themselves aren't the best at advocating for their own needs. I've not seen them as present in the lobbying world and whatnot. I think we should have more of a dialogue with them and say, you know, we'll be there to work with you, but you also need to respond to some of our expectations. I don't know if any of you are already connected to that industry and industry associations, but it's a big gap I think could be filled, is building those relationships there.
How about also contacting likely unions that might
Yeah.
be interested in organizing, like Unifor,
Totally.
workers?
Totally. Yeah, I mean,
So-
absolutely. And
So SCAN has a lot of like former union activists, and I
Right.
think that's something that we can work on.
I think that would be excellent. I know a lot of people in unions, like I've heard from Unifor at least, they're now having a climate task force where they're going to try to go across the country, speak to their locals. But like, I think support there would be well received, especially from people formerly in the movement who already know dynamics and the politics there.
Mm-hmm. What did you say? Unifor had climate task force?
Task force,
Okay.
yeah.
Worth looking. Yeah, that would be a logical group to contact. Thank you.
Oh, Allie, thank you so much. This was just a tour de force. I can promise you we'll do our best to follow up on the advocacy front as well with some of the things you proposed. We certainly will. I wanted just on the justice front to ask you quickly whether or not we'd followed up in any way on the US initiative that came out early in the Biden administration sort of IRA, which was called basically Justice 40. You know, they are hiving off 40% of all of the federal programs towards disadvantaged communities. That always seemed that they were more systematic than we've been on those kinds of things, and more committed to it because they had that specific initiative.
I agree. I think you have the right analysis. In Canada, there's certainly talk about disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, but in the way I've seen it now, I don't think there's a very specific like effort to actually, you know, meet these communities where they're at. And I think I found, even though it's very important to me that workers in the fossil fuel industry or in high emitting sectors get transitioned, I think often indirect workers, so workers in the service industry around, who are often women or often racialized communities, I'm not sure they have received the same amount of care and attention to make sure they're not left behind, right? So I think it's something, if the Sustainable Jobs Act passes, let's hope it passes, you know, by June, because otherwise it would delay it so much, then it could be interesting for it to be a specific thing we advocate for, because once it passes, they have to table a Sustainable Jobs Action Plan before the end of 2025. That's their requirement under this bill. And so we could advocate, or we could be setting the expectation publicly, this Sustainable Jobs Action Plan has to have a section specifically, as you were talking about, like Justice 40. So yeah, that's a good flag. I think we have an opportunity to input, but I'm going to be honest, I don't think it's like really seriously on their radar, you know?
Thank you, Allie.
Thank you. Thank you, Allie. That was a really good presentation, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I just wanted to say, since we're on this topic of jobs in renewables, is where is the government at with the their transition legislation? Like, they wanted to have a plan, right? They said they would have a plan. And related to that, the Youth Climate Corps, if that's, so there's a couple of topics.
Oh yeah, so the government had promised in 2019 a just transition legislation. The concept is a great one. You know, Spain, New Zealand, Scotland, they've all had developed just transition legislations, which basically says we're legally committing ourselves to supporting people. So it's not just like one minister cares about workers and does it and the next one forgets. We're legally committing to help our workers transition and workers in communities. So the government had promised that. There was a big political backlash sponsored by the fossil fuel industry and by politicians, including Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who said, we don't like just transition because we don't want a transition. And so they said, okay, fine, we'll do a sustainable jobs bill instead. We'll talk about sustainable jobs. And so that bill was tabled in June 2023. It was, first when it came out, it was quite weak, I'll be honest. It missed, for example, it didn't actually legally commit the sustainable jobs, team in the government to make sure that all their stuff was aligned with Canada's climate commitments. So a bit of a mismatch there. They could be creating jobs in industries that have nothing to do with climate, label them sustainable jobs. But I was very involved in the lobbying, and we ended up getting, thanks to unions and a bunch of opposition parties played a great role this time around really supporting amendments. So now the bill has been amended. It's much stronger. It's not perfect. I think it's very weak on Indigenous nations having specific access to resources. But for workers, it's much better. And fortunately, it is now blocked in those mysterious parts of the government process between committee and getting past Parliament so we can go to the Senate. And it is blocked because some politicians are filibustering it and have been since December. And we are completely stuck, and we're not sure how to get unstuck because the issue is they could just filibuster for open a debate and then get people to have to do a voting marathon. You put amendments that are futile amendments just to delay the bill. So very unfortunate. I think actually it's good that you asked, because I think in the coming 3 days we'll be trying to put out a petition that calls on all leaders to put politics aside, favor workers. So maybe I can follow up with you on that one, but it's just so unfortunate. You have a bill that's ready and it's just
Is that the Conservatives blocking, or is anybody else making trouble?
Yeah, with my nonpartisan hat, I can say that we have been seeing, it's in this case, it has been Conservative members of Parliament specifically, especially on the committee that's just blocking it. Yes.
So lobbying constituents in their ridings to
100%.
complain to them about them blocking this bill. It's for our youth, right? Everybody cares about youth having opportunities, and most people understand we're in a transition. So
totally.
Yeah.
Yes, and maybe to add, also making sure that the government hears from us that we want this, because of course for them they're getting resistance, and so it's easier for them to shy away from a fight or say, well, maybe we'll just go for more winnable ones. So if we show that this is a winnable fight, this is something that we want, I think that would also go a long way. And that's why anything public, Twitter storms, letters to the editors, if some of you are good writers, opinion pieces would be so helpful. And quickly on the topic of the Youth Climate Corps, I don't know if everybody's familiar with that idea, but Seth Klein, who wrote a really good book called A Good War, talking about how we should take a wartime approach to solving climate change, said one of the things we need to do is have a Youth Climate Corps and employ a bunch of young people into climate-related jobs, whether it's clean energy, whether it's land rehabilitation, whether it's anything else. We give young people a good job, we have all the workforce we need, and we also employ all these people who are otherwise really feeling disenfranchised. So there's good political traction, but I've not seen a lot of actual progress. A lot of people have said, a lot of politicians have said, this is a great idea. I've not actually seen it in a bill or a policy. So maybe we need a champion in government to actually take that on.
I think Laurel Collins has put a bill in.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Actually, she has. Yeah. She's doing great work.
Private members' bill. So that doesn't necessarily go very far, but I really hear you about they need to hear from us. And speaking of that, on Friday is the deadline for the federal budget input, right? So do you have a template or ideas about that, or you know?
I don't think we have a template this time. I wonder, sometimes they do it as a very accessible form.
It is, and there's only like 3 questions, like what do you care about for you and your family? Like it's intended for ordinary people to fill in. So I'll just find that link for that page, and people could go there and send just a few sentences in or something if they like.
What is environmental defense doing to prepare for a possible or probable conservative government?
That is a big one. I think I'm nervously laughing because I think Leticia has it there. I mean, and so to be clear and also to be transparent with you, we are a charity, and so we're asked by the CRA not to be partisan, and we really want to respect that because we think that also makes us in many ways credible, to make sure that we will hold any party accountable the same way. And that's important to us. Like, they're not our friends. We're not nicer because they're this color or this color. That being said, like, we know from past conservative governments that it was harder on us because there was a lot more, there was just, momentum in the direction we would want. So I think at this stage, our immediate focus is, can we future-proof any policy that we've secured? Because we don't know what's going to happen with this election, and we're not seeking to influence the election because we're a charity, so we can't be doing that work. So therefore, how do we future-proof policies? How do we say these policies are going to be so good that no government would want to roll them back, right? So I'm thinking on, the hope with like carbon pricing was that people would see the interest of getting the rebates and wouldn't want to roll it back, or companies would already have mapped out their plan taking carbon pricing in mind, they wouldn't want to roll it back. Or sustainable jobs. Let's hope that people have already appreciated enough the process of having a sustainable jobs action plan, seeing themselves in the plan, that no politician could even think of stepping on that and removing it. But that leaves us a pretty short window. So I think thinking of that, and we are also thinking our dream is all political parties have a strong platform on climate change, right? Because then the debate is elevated to who has the best climate change platform instead of party with a plan, party with no plan, which is really an unfortunate situation to be in for us. So I think we're also trying to do more work with all parties, saying, what's your climate target, what's your climate plan, etc. It's gonna be some of the work. But I would encourage groups that are either more local or have a different role in the movement. I think we're more placed to be policy reactive. We're not really influencing elections because of what I was saying about our status.
Okay, thank you. Not terribly encouraging, but thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I mean, sorry. What organization in Canada do you think is best placed to influence the public dialogue on climate action? In other words, you're saying environmental defense is not the group. Yeah, who is?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's very elections focused, then it would be groups that are okay to be maybe partisan, or either groups that are okay to be partisan, and that's one way to do it, or groups that are really focused on getting out the vote on specific issues. So in the past, we've seen a group that used to be called Future Majority, that's now called New Majority, do work. Lead Now tends to do work. So those are interesting ones. Of course, there's the groups that actually just select a few key star candidates and help them get elected. I think that has a lot of value because we know some ridings are really just a few hundred votes away. So making sure that those community champions are there. Honestly, I would also say, if some of you are members of parties, now is a really good time for that party membership to get active. It's going to be a bit late, a few months before the elections, because things will be solidified. They'll have their messages. But if you're a party member, if you would consider being a party member, now is a really good time to influence the actual platform. So that could also be an interesting project. Yeah.
That's more positive. Thank you.
Better?
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm.
Oh, Lynn has another question.
Yeah, if you don't
Taking
mind,
over,
I
apologize.
just got going on that questionnaire that I put the link in for. Let's talk budget. It's the first time I looked at it. There's a lot of questions that we can indicate our preferences for, and I put the Youth Climate Corps as one of the other, like they have a certain number that you can click in each of their questions of their survey. And so there's a lot of scope in there. So I encourage people to go on there, and then they're going to say, what is one, they have one question, what will help people in your community? And I'm putting in municipal climate action plan support. We need money. Do people here all understand? We're doing the budget vote at City Hall on the 14th, and there is not enough money to do our climate action here. So we need revenue tools from the federal government and provincial government, or actual money. And all the municipalities in Canada need it. So I'll actually, I think there's a link to the Star article. There's a Star article about we're losing the fight on climate change at our city level. So if you could even get that 1 point in that questionnaire, that would be great. I think the Canadian Federation of Municipalities is working on this, but I think the grassroots vote, they want to know what voters think. So the more people that put that in, the better. Thank you.
I got a direct message question, which I think is probably good to address to everybody. But just to let you know, someone was asking, it seems that our civil servants aren't not great at helping our government communicate effectively climate policy. And so, there's a lot of blowback. What can we do about that? Obviously, I know some of you actually have experience being civil servants and might have an answer as to like, we need more money or something. But, I think for us, what we've noticed is often there's topics on which I have more time than someone who works for the minister's office to think about it. Like, unfortunately, they're being asked to work on many, many different things at once. So it is a real service to them when we could say, hey, we piloted these 3 types of messaging on the same idea, and this one worked best. And I think they've shown themselves to be very open to that. Like, it's the type of moment where if we can help by lending a bit of extra brain capacity and time, or, it's always been appreciated by the folks that I've talked to. A lot of them really want to do this work well and just don't have time because they're asked to deal with 50 priorities at once. So I would say if you have noticed, well, this messaging's worked super well on this, then like actually writing up a little brief around like how you tested it, why that worked, would probably be well received.
Allie, I just want to comment quickly. As Michael said, one of the small working groups that we have as part of the advocacy group is to look at what's happening on communication. And we spend a fair bit of time looking at the Later is Too Late report, which was done by a group, Potential Energy. They surveyed 23 countries. There's 60,000 different surveys that went out. It's a phenomenal group, and it's looking at, and wrote about how to speak like a human, and tested so many of the messages that it's really worth taking a look at and seeing how relevant it is to in the Canadian context.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I've not looked at it yet, but I heard great things about that report.
I can add some of the questions that we didn't get to. I see we still have 7 minutes. Are you up for this, Allie?
Sure.
Michael Berger was asking about whether people in the sort of COP community are talking about biochar. I know this is a special interest of Michael's.
Not much. No, to make it
No?
brief, not much. There might have been a few pavilions where it came up, but you would have had to really search for that pavilion in a specific presentation. So not like a spotlight issue, in my experience at least. Keeping in mind there's like 80,000 people there, so perhaps I missed it, but yes. And 80,000 was record breaking by like 3 times the number that I had ever been before. So I'm hoping we never do that again. It's too many people for one conference.
Okay, thank you. What is the best way for groups like ours to monitor, Canada's climate commitments that we make at COP?
Yeah.
we promise, and I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, some of that should be the role of, even organizations like Environmental Defense, who have staff who should be looking at this. So hopefully we're able to do that. And it could be something we could work on, is like in a few months, like a 6 month after COP, where are we at? We could certainly, offer that capacity to make sure that we're properly communicating with your groups what is up. But I know that on general things, I look at things like Carbon Tracker, which is a good resource in general for climate pledges. That's my go-to for an overview. They might not have the latest policy, but they'll tell you if Canada's overall the type of country that's on track for our climate goals or not on track. Unfortunately, we're really not on track at all right now.
I think most of us know that. Okay. And I guess just to wrap up and let you have your drink, which you so deserve. What gives you hope in all of this? There's so much bad news, and we're so far behind.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, well, there's two things. The first one is I'm going to be very honest with you. Maybe that makes me sound like a bit of a crazy person, but I'm not always motivated by hope. I'm quite motivated by actually anger at the injustice. I know some people are really motivated by the prospect of future joy and future equity. That's what appeals some people that join this kind of work. For me, it was quite the opposite. It was anger at the fact that people are actively profiting off, harm of people suffering. It was, I told you initially I was interested in human rights when I lived in south of France. I was very involved in refugee rights movements, and knowing that we were going to create more forced displacement that we could avoid, like we can avoid it. So I think for me, it's anger. And so there's many times where I don't feel hopeful, but I think if I stop, I'm letting people off the hook. So that's more my driver. However, I think like the most hopeful thing is continuing to see more and more people find their little strategic way to contribute to climate action. I'm really liking the trend of people not trying to be, the next or the Greta, because that's not what everybody's well placed to. Like, she's an excellent, outstanding person, but not everybody can do that. So finding people that are like, well, me in my accounting role, me as someone that understands, private finance, me as an artist. And I really, I don't know, I find that really, it's like our army is growing, but we're not all side by side. We just know that we're there. That's really, motivating, energizing.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, again, a very, very big thank you for being so generous and supportive, and just trusting me with this space and all that. I know all of you have are so accomplished and so knowledgeable, and it's very generous of you to just ask me questions, and I have many for you as well. I hope we can talk about later on.
Absolutely.
I think any of us would be very happy to answer your questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to thank Karen Sadleir-Brown and Liz Addison and Sharon and Michael for their contributions to a great meeting. Thank you so much. It's been so fabulously organized, and well done.
Yep. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.